My name is Gabriel, and until a few months ago, I was a typical 22-year-old college student. Everything changed on that fateful night when I decided to take a shortcut through the infamous Highway 666. During a trip back home, I had heard the legends about that cursed road, but I always considered them small-town nonsense. How foolish I was. What happened that night haunts me to this day, making me question my own sanity and the nature of the reality that surrounds us. This is my story, an account of the terrible events that turned my life into an endless nightmare. It was a Friday night, and I was eager to get home after exhausting weeks of final exams. The sky was cloudy, and a fine mist began to form as I entered Highway 666. At first, everything seemed normal. The road was deserted. That wasn't unusual for that time of night. After about half an hour of travel, I noticed something strange. The fog had become denser, and I could no longer see the mileage sign. I checked my cell phone's GPS. The screen was distorted, showing only static. It was then that I realized the car radio wasn't working either. It emitted only an irritating buzz. A chill ran down my spine when I saw a shadowy figure on the side of the road. For a moment, I thought it was someone in need of help, but as I passed by, I realized it wasn't human. It was too tall, with long, thin limbs that twisted unnaturally. I blinked quickly, and when I looked again, the figure had disappeared. My heart started to race. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, a result of travel fatigue. But then, something even more disturbing happened. The road lines began to move, writhing like white snakes on the asphalt. I rubbed my eyes hard, but the vision persisted. Suddenly, my car gave a violent jolt. I stepped on the brake, but nothing happened. The vehicle kept moving forward, as if pulled by an invisible force. The steering wheel turned by itself, and I became a helpless passenger in my own car. When it finally stopped, I was in front of a huge rusty gate. Beyond it, I could see the shadowy outlines of a ghost town. Abandoned buildings rose against the dark sky, their broken windows looking like empty eyes watching me. With trembling hands, I tried to start the car again, but the engine didn't make a sound. I looked around, desperate for some sign of life or civilization, but there was only darkness and silence. It was then that I heard a voice whispering my name, coming from somewhere inside the abandoned city. Gabriel, Gabriel, come home, Gabriel. The voice was familiar and strange at the same time, as if it were a distorted mixture of all the people I had ever known. I felt an inexplicable compulsion to get out of the car and cross that gate. My mind screamed for me to stay where I was, but my body wouldn't obey. Before I knew it, I was standing in front of the gate. It opened with an ominous creak, as if inviting me in. With hesitant steps, I entered the ghost town, feeling as if I was crossing a threshold into another world. The streets were covered by a thin layer of fog that seemed to glow with its own supernatural light. As I walked, I noticed that the shadows around me moved in unnatural ways, as if they had a life of their own. At times, I swore I saw faces forming in them, expressions of pain and despair that disappeared as soon as I tried to focus on them. The voice kept calling me, now coming from several directions at once. I wanted to run away, but my feet were taking me deeper and deeper into the city. The buildings around me seemed to change and twist when I wasn't looking directly at them. It was as if reality itself was unraveling around me. I reached a central square, where a large clock tower stood. Its hands were spinning madly in opposite directions, and the numbers on the dial changed every second to symbols I had never seen before. In the center of the square, there was a dry fountain, and inside it, an object that glowed with a pulsating red light. I approached the fountain, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. The object was a small hand mirror, adorned with strange symbols on its frame. When I picked it up, the surface of the mirror rippled like water, and for a moment, I saw a face that wasn't mine reflected in it. It was the face of an elderly woman, with completely black eyes and a smile full of sharp teeth. Frightened, I dropped the mirror, but before it hit the ground, it simply disappeared. That moment, I heard a deafening scream coming from everywhere at once. The windows of the surrounding buildings shattered, and an invisible force threw me to the ground. When I got up, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. Shadowy figures emerged from every alley and corner, slowly advancing towards me. Their shapes were indistinct and mutable, as if they were made of black smoke, and they all had the same black eyes I saw in the mirror. Paralyzed with terror, I saw the shadowy figures getting closer and closer. Their bodies undulated unnaturally, as if they were made of liquid shadows. The air around me turned icy cold, and I could see my own breath forming clouds of vapor in front of me. Desperate, I ran towards a narrow alley, hoping to find an escape route. The walls of the alley seemed to close in on me, and I could hear whispers coming from them, as if the stones themselves were alive and talking to me. "Gabriel, you can't escape. You belong to us now." Stumbling over my own feet, I fell on the hard, cold ground. When I turned around, I saw that the shadowy creatures had caught up with me. They hovered over me, their bodies merging and separating in a macabre ballet of darkness. Suddenly, I felt something cold and metallic in my hand. I looked down and saw that I was holding the old mirror again. This time, when I looked at its surface, I saw my own reflection. But something was wrong. My eyes and the reflection were completely black, just like those of the creatures. A voice echoed in my mind, clearer than ever. "Look closely, Gabriel. See who you really are." At that moment, I was flooded with a torrent of memories that I didn't recognize as my own. I saw myself in different times, in different bodies, always in the same city. I saw horrible crimes being committed by my hands, heard the screams of the victims, felt the perverse pleasure that past me felt in inflicting pain and suffering. I dropped the mirror, horrified by what I had seen. But the visions didn't stop. The reality around me began to distort even more. The walls of the alley turned into pulsating flesh, and agonizing faces emerged from it, screaming silently. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to block out those terrible visions, but they continued, now projected onto the dark screen of my closed eyelid. When I opened them again, I realized I was back in the central square. Everything had changed. The sky above me was a whirlwind of impossible colors, and the clock tower now stood like a black monolith, seemed to suck the very light around it. The shadowy figures had gathered in a circle around me, their bodies merging to form a single monstrous being of multiple faces and limbs. The creature spoke, its voice a cacophony of thousands of agonized screams. "Welcome back, Gabriel. You have finally returned home." I tried to deny it, to shout that it wasn't true, that I didn't belong in that horrible place. But the words died in my throat when I saw my own hands. They were transforming, becoming black and ethereal like those of the shadowy creatures. An overwhelming panic took hold of me. I couldn't accept that this was real, that I was part of this nightmare. With a desperate cry, I threw myself against the mass of shadows, determined to escape at any cost. To my surprise, I passed through the creature as if it were made of smoke. I fell to the ground on the other side, panting and shaking. When I got up, I saw that I was back on Highway 666. My car parked a few meters ahead. I ran to the vehicle, my hands still trembling as I tried to fit the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored the accelerator, eager to leave that cursed place behind. As I drove back to civilization, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a hallucination, vivid nightmare caused by fatigue and stress. But something inside me knew it wasn't that simple. In the days that followed, I tried to resume my normal life, but the memories of that night constantly haunted me. I began to have recurring nightmares, always involving the ghost town and the shadowy creatures. Sometimes, I would wake up in the middle of the night, certain that I had seen a dark figure standing at the foot of my bed, only for it to disappear when I turned on the light. My behavior began to change. I became paranoid, always looking over my shoulder, certain that I was being watched. I started avoiding mirrors, fearing to see those black eyes staring at me again. I obsessively researched Highway 666 and the ghost town, found nothing concrete. It was as if that place didn't exist in the real world. I tried to go back there once, driving the same route, but I never found the detour that led me to that cursed city. Weeks passed, and I was beginning to wonder if I was losing my sanity. It was then that something happened, something that proved my experience wasn't just a delusion. One night, while I was absent-mindedly leafing through an old book I had bought in a used bookstore, a photograph fell from between its pages. My blood froze when I picked it up. It was a black and white photo, yellowed with time, showing a city that I immediately recognized. The same ghost town from Highway 666. With trembling hands, I turned the photo over. On the back, there was an inscription. Ashville, 1923, The Great Fire. Below, an additional note said, "May the lost souls find eternal rest." My mind was spinning. Ashville. The name resonated in my memory, bringing up flashes of the visions I had on that terrible night. I began to frantically research Ashville and its Great Fire. What I discovered horrified me. Ashville was a small town that had been completely destroyed by a mysterious fire in 1923. The historical records were vague, but mentioned rumors of occult rituals and demonic pacts that had supposedly attracted divine wrath. The most disturbing, however, was a list of names I found, the victims of the fire. Among them was Gabriel Ashworth, described as a local recluse with a sinister reputation. Feeling sick, I closed the laptop. Couldn't be a coincidence. Somehow I was connected to this Gabriel Ashworth, to this cursed city. In the days that followed, my paranoia reached new heights. I began to see strange symbols everywhere, in the cracks of sidewalks, in cloud patterns, even in the coffee stains at the bottom of cups. It was as if the universe was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't decipher the message. One night I woke up in a cold sweat, certain that something was wrong. I looked at the digital clock beside the bed and froze. The numbers were flashing repeatedly. 0666. At that moment, I heard a sound coming from the living room, the soft tinkling of a bell. With my heart racing, I left the bedroom. In the dimness of the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Old mirror from the ghost town was hanging on the wall, where there had only been a painting before. I approached slowly, unable to look away. The surface of the mirror rippled, and suddenly it was no longer my reflection staring back at me, but the face of Gabriel Ashworth, my face from a past life. He smiled, a smile full of malice and dark promises. His lips moved, and I heard his voice as if it were inside my head. You finally understand, don't you? There's no escape. You always come back. You will always come back. I screamed and threw the first object I found at the mirror. The glass shattered, but instead of falling to the floor, fragments remained suspended in the air, each reflecting a different part of the ghost town. Suddenly, I felt as if I was being pulled. The world around me began to spin and distort. I tried to grab onto something, anything, but it was useless. I was sucked into the broken mirror, falling through a whirlwind of memories and nightmares. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in the central square of Ashville. The shadowy creatures surrounded me, their black eyes gleaming with evil triumph. "Welcome back, Gabriel," they said in unison, "this time to stay." As the darkness engulfed me, I had one last and terrible understanding. This cycle of horror, this macabre dance between realities, would never end. I was trapped in an eternal loop of guilt, punishment, and rebirth. And so, my story, our story, continues. Perhaps one day, in some future life, I will find redemption. Or maybe I'm condemned to relive this nightmare forever, prisoner of Highway 666, and the sins of a past I can't fully remember. Do you ever find yourself driving on a lonely road on a dark night and see a detour that wasn't on the map? I beg you, don't follow it, for you may end up in Ashville, where time has no meaning, and the shadows are always hungry for new souls to torment. As for me, I remain here, trapped between worlds, waiting. And who knows, maybe one day it will be you who I see on the other side of the mirror, ready to take my place in this endless cycle of horror.